So you were led to believe that the team you just put together is one of the best in the game. Just press Q and deal 1,000,000 damage. But if you're still getting into the web of mechanics that make up Genshin's combat, you might find that your damage doesn't quite match up with what you've been told. Maybe you just need better artifacts, but maybe what you're missing is the proper rotation. I've made some guides on building good teams, but they were so focused on how characters fit into those teams that I simply didn't have enough time to really dive into how to actually play them. So to rectify that, I wanted to make another video dedicated entirely to rotations. A rotation is simply what order you use all of your character's abilities in, and once the rotation is over, you repeat it again from the top. Let's jump right in with an example. Here we have the current best team in the game, Mavuika, Bennett, Citlali, plus one more good support, and I'm going to use Citlali. But beyond being the best team in the game, it has a relatively strict rotation, so it'll give us lots to talk about. The gear your characters are using also plays an important role in your rotation, but I don't want to get too into character building in this guide, so I'll just be talking about the most important items and put the rest in the text overlays. The first step is knowing what benefits each of your characters provides to the team and how to activate them. Bennett's value comes from his elemental burst, which grants a massive attack buff to Mavuika, as well as even more attack from his artifact set. Shilonen's value comes from her elemental skill, which shreds the enemy's resistance to our team's elements, as well as damage bonus from her artifact set. Citlali provides more res shred, more damage bonus from her artifacts, attack from her weapon, Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, and most importantly, off-field cryo application from her skill and burst combo, so that Mavuika can trigger melt with her big attacks. Then, of course, Mavuika, whose primary damage source is her elemental burst, which she can then follow up with some highly buffed bike attacks. That's the basics out of the way, so now let's talk timing. As we know, when your rotation is over, you start it again. So an important thing to figure out is, when is your rotation over? The biggest factor is how long all of your character's cooldowns are, because you of course cannot do another rotation if your important abilities are still on cooldown. Ideally, you want your main DPS's cooldowns to be the longest, since those are where your damage comes from in most teams, and you want to do that damage as often as you can without being delayed by your support's cooldowns. So in this case, that's 18 seconds. However, as you can see by the listed ability cooldowns, if you want everything to be the same every rotation, you'll need to plan for 20 seconds because of the TTDS cooldown. The question is, which results in higher DPS? Losing the TTDS buff every other rotation, or shortening the rotation by 2 seconds? To figure it out, we'll need to know what we're doing in those extra 2 seconds. At this point, I want to mention that even if you plan out an 18-second rotation, you're almost certainly not going to be pressing the buttons with perfect timing, because you're a human being and not a robot. Plus, you might be forced to dodge at some point, adding time to the rotation as well, or maybe you didn't dodge and took a bunch of damage or got knocked back. So long story short, I would just go for the 18-second rotation, and maybe there will be enough delays to make it 20 seconds anyway. Either way, the only way to be sure which rotation is more DPS on average is to calculate it. I'm not going to get into DPS calculations in this video, but I can at least point you to some resources if you want to explore that yourself, like the fandom wiki for damage formulas and exact stat values, theory crafting content creators like Zejef77 who show how they do their team DPS calcs on stream, and for those who really want to get into it, GC Sim, where you can run combat simulations with specific teams, gear, and rotations if you learn how to program them, or just browse ones that other people have made. That said, keep in mind that it is a simulator, so it is effectively a robot and not a human being, so it can press every single input with perfect timing. The next factor to consider in your rotation is whether you have any buffs that require reactions to activate, or a buff like TTDS that restricts when you can swap to specific characters. In this case, we have Shilonen's Archaic Petra, Citlali's Cinder City, and Citlali's TTDS. In order to make sure we buff Mavuika's Pyro damage, Pyro has to be applied before we swap to Shilonen to apply Geo. Then she needs to collect the resulting Crystallized Shard, and the Pyro also needs to be applied before we swap to Citlali. And because Citlali is using TTDS, she has to be the final support before we start DPSing on Mavuika. Let's keep this in the back of our minds for now. The final factor in building your rotation is how long your buffs last, especially any buffed state that your carry uses to actually deal any damage. For most such carries, you only want to on-field them during this state, and once it ends, hopefully your cooldowns are back too so you can do another rotation, because they are done dealing damage at this point. I've listed the duration of our most important buffs here. With this in mind, we need to decide what order we are going to activate these buffs in order to maximize the time that our carry will have them, with those requirements to activate them still in mind. The general rule is to have the longest lasting buffs first, and because of TTDS, Citlali must be right before Mavuika. Shilonen's Archaic Petra is the shortest buff other than that, so we need her right before Citlali, and that means we start with Bennett. So that determines our setup, which is the part of the rotation where you activate all of your important abilities before doing damage on your carry, so that your carry actually does does damage. Bennett's skill into burst, Shilonen's skill into 2 normal attacks and making sure to collect the crystallized shard, Citlali's skill into burst, then end our setup by using Mavuika Burst, and we'll get to the rest later. Now let's double check our buff activation requirements. This rotation gives us Bennett's Pyro for Shilonen, so we're good there. Because Bennett applies 2U of Pyro, the enemy will likely still have a Pyro aura for Citlali to react with, but even if they don't, Bennett's Burst self-applies Pyro, and Citlali's skill self-applies Cryo, so Citlali will trigger Melt on herself, and that activates Cinder City just fine. So that's our setup. Now then, our setup is about 9 seconds altogether. To be clear, I got these numbers from watching the recording of myself playing, so some people might be able to do it faster, or some slower. For a rough estimate, you can guess that skills take just under a second, bursts take about 1 second for 4 stars, and 2 seconds for 5 stars, and that's probably close enough to plan out your buff durations. Like I said earlier, we're all human, so it's going to take some random fractions of a second to do all the inputs, since Genshin doesn't have proper input buffering. In the following 7 seconds, Mavuika will have her burst buff, which we want to take full advantage of. Then we have 1.5 seconds of time left to pad out to meet our 18-second rotation. Our best filler is to simply keep attacking with Mavuika's bike. However, Mavuika's Night Soul's blessing state will end too early if we try to just do that. More importantly, Bennett needs tons of energy and he's just not getting it with this rotation. You might think he just needs more energy recharge, but we can actually solve this problem by tweaking our rotation rather than messing with our gear. The solution to both problems is using Mavuika's skill before we swap to Bennett, as the first ability we use in the rotation, and funneling the elemental particles to him. Some final notes on our setup: you may have noticed that I used Bennett's burst before his skill, and that was to make sure his energy wasn't full when he collected Mavuika's particles, because then the particles just go to waste. That does cut into buff uptime, so it might not be optimal, but those are the main 2 factors when deciding if you should skill then burst, or burst then skill. A lot of the time you want your support to collect the particles they generate from their own skill, and they'll do that during the burst animation. But if you burst and then skill, they'll be off-field by the time the particles get to you, unless you purposely wait for them, so your next character will pick them up. An exception to this is booking, but that's usually just a trick for speedrunners, so let's not worry about it. A special third factor could be optimizing fav procs. For example, if my C1 Shenhe does double skill then burst, that's only 3 hits that could proc fav. If I burst then double skill, it's 5 hits, because the burst will hit 2 more times while I cast my skills. And if you're wondering what this little extension is after his actual burst duration, that's to account for the fact that the attack buff from his burst actually persists for about 2 seconds after you leave the circle, whether it's from the burst ending or you moving out of it. Let's wrap up the discussion of this team's rotation with Mavuika's attack combo. To determine an optimal attack combo, you'd look at a character's attack options, their motion values, time how long it takes to perform the attacks, and do some math to see what combo results in the highest total motion value percentage in the time that you have. But let's be honest, most people aren't going to do that. Luckily, theory crafters are happy to do this for us, and then just tell us all the optimal attack combo. Plus, to this day, people are still hunting for even higher DPS Mavuika combos. So the best idea for the average player is to just head over to kachingmains.com, check the guide for your carry, and see what they say the optimal attack combo is. They might also just tell you the optimal rotation for your team as well, if it's a popular one, but anyway, beyond just optimizing our motion values, for a forward reaction team like the one we're discussing, we also need to know when our attack combo is going to apply its element, and when our off-fielder is going to apply their element, and make sure we never have our carry apply an element before the off-fielder does it first, because then we get stuck with the wrong aura and now your DPS drops into the abyss. Elemental application depends a lot on the concepts of elemental gauge theory and ICD. I've discussed both of those in multiple other videos, so I won't do a long explanation here, and instead just discuss the end result, that being the rotation. This upcoming section is specific to this one team, but the idea is the same for most reaction teams, so I think it will be helpful to go over regardless. Citlali's burst hit applies 2U of Cryo, and her skill, Frostfall Storm and Spirit Vessel Skulls, should each apply 1U of Cryo a total of 4 more times before Mavuika's burst hits, so you're virtually guaranteed to forward melt it barring any outstanding factors. Then, Frostfall Storm should tick again immediately to apply Cryo for Mavuika to begin melting her attack combo, and apply Cryo again every 2 seconds. So we need to make sure Mavuika doesn't apply Pyro faster than that. Her highest DPS combos without reactions will obviously be too fast. Even something like just holding her charged attack will also be too fast, unless you purposely delay it. For now, the best combo for the average player to use is 3 charged attack hits, the charged attack finisher, a very quick sprint attack, then 3 more charged attack hits, and the charged attack finisher. Note that the finisher into the sprint attack have to be performed very quickly, so if you notice you are getting a pyro aura when you try it, you'll either need to do the inputs faster, or simply leave out the sprint attack entirely. Important side note, that sprint attack is called an animation cancel, specifically a dash cancel, and its main purpose is to cut off the long finisher animation so that you can do the next charged attack even faster. And just to pad out the final 1.5 seconds of our rotation, we can end it with 1 more charged attack and finisher, and then reactivating her skill and taking the rotation from the top. One last thing, when I introduced this team, I made a note that Escoffier is better for it than Chilonen. There are a few reasons for that, but the one I want to focus on is that, like Citlali, Escoffier also applies cryo every 2 seconds, which means that if you stagger their skills, your off-fielders can apply cryo once per second, allowing you to do even more rapidly hitting Mavuika combos. But we spent enough time on one team. And that pretty much covers the general process that you'll want to go through when coming up with a rotation for your team. So the video's over, right? No. Despite what certain haters may tell you, Genshin rotations can have way more depth than that. The next team with interesting things to talk about, Neuvillette Hypercarry, or Monohydro depending on your definition of Hypercarry. This was the best team before Mavuika. We've got Chilonen again, except this time she's the one on Cinder City, and we actually use her burst for the healing because of the next character, Furina, who grants a huge damage bonus through her burst when the team's HP changes, and uses her skill to drain our HP to facilitate that. Neuvillette is our carry here, who deals damage with his charged attack, but needs his skill and burst to use the source water droplets that make the charged attack faster. And lastly, Kazuha, who grants extra res shred from VV and more damage bonus with his A4 passive. And because the only aura we can apply is Hydro, we shouldn't have any problems activating any buffs that require a reaction. But hang on, if we just put together the rotation as before, it's actually not optimal. Because of the amount of time it takes to do our setup and Neuvillette's charged attacks, we are already multiple seconds past our longest cooldown length. So unlike the last team, we can't base our rotation length around our carry's cooldowns. But that's fine, because also unlike Mavuika, Neuvillette doesn't have all his damage come from a single ability cast and subsequent buff. Plus, we can swap off of him and back on in the middle of the rotation without losing anything. So this time, we build our rotation around getting the most out of Neuvillette's charged attacks, by doing as many as we can during the uptime of our supports' buffs. 2 of these supports we can swap to twice per rotation to maintain their buffs. As an added bonus, using more skills means more energy per rotation, lowering the amount of energy recharge your characters will need. So here's our new rotation. While Furina's buff lasts the longest, the other 2 supports can refresh their buffs, so Furina is last in the setup. As before, we start with our carry skill, but rather than just being to help with energy, it's also to apply our Hydro to activate buffs with it, as well as to put it on cooldown as soon as possible. Plus, the source water droplets it generates will remain on the ground for a while, so they'll still be there when we need them later in the rotation. A skill's effects being delayed in this way is rare, but makes some rotations more interesting. Another thing you may have noticed is that we swap to Furina twice in the setup. I already explained why we use her burst last, but we use her skill first for 2 reasons. One is to collect the elemental particles funneled from Neuvillette's skill. The other is so her salon members can start draining our HP as soon as possible, so that we have something to heal back up to stack her burst's fanfare, increasing her damage buff. The rest of the rotation, including Neuvillette's attack pattern, is optimized to generate fanfare as fast as possible, so more of the rotation gets a bigger buff. As a final note on this team, my Neuvillette is using Sacrificial Jade, which means he can't stay on field for more than 10 seconds at a time, or he loses the buffs from it. Luckily, swapping off him to use support skills resolves that, so we just need to do that before 10 seconds is up. With this rotation, you have no margin for error in the first half of his on-field time. You will need to do another animation cancel trick like we talked about with Mavuika. This time you need to release your charged attack the instant you've collected the 3 source water droplets, which will cause it to fire immediately, rather than charging up for a second. You'll need to do it well, and do it every time. If you aren't confident you can do it in time, you can use a lower DPS rotation to guarantee you maintain your Sac Jade, which shortens the first part of his field time and lengthens the second part. This one is worse because it generates fanfare slower, and also guarantees you lose both Kazuha's buffs and Sacrificial Jade by the very end of it, but you'll get them back during setup. And it's better than messing up the first one and losing Sacrificial Jade even earlier. For the next interesting team, let's go all the way back to 1.0. National was the best team in the game all the way into 3.0. Using our basic process, the setup would look like this, and be 21 or 22 seconds depending on if you use and proc sack on Xingqiu or not. Since these characters are all off-fielders, the rotation after the setup doesn't really matter as long as we're normal attacking constantly to proc Xingqiu's burst so that Zhongling's burst can trigger reverse vaporize. On-fielding Sucrose would allow us to trigger swirls and continuously activate VV, but that's mostly only valuable in multi-target scenarios to help spread the Hydro aura, since Xingqiu's burst is single target. Beyond that, we should make sure to use Bennett's skill in there and funnel the particles to Zhongling because she'll need them. But we can improve this rotation quite a bit. The main thing to keep in mind is that Zhongling's burst snapshots, which means it will base its damage on Zhongling's stats at the moment she casts it, buffs and all. Long story short, this means we can activate our buffs in whatever order we want and take extra time in our setup as long as the buffs Zhongling needs are active at the moment she casts her burst. The only exception on this team is the Res Shred from Sucrose's VV set, which can't be snapshotted since it's not a stat on Zhongling but rather a stat on the enemy. But we can refresh that whenever we want. With that in mind, there are 3 more things we want out of this rotation: funneling Bennett's particles to Zhongling, double swirling Hydro and Pyro to get Res Shred on both, and forward vaping Xingqiu's big skill hits. And we can do all of this with a few tweaks. The funneling is easily accomplished by doing Bennett's burst into skill and swapping to Zhongling. The double swirl is accomplished by using Zhongling's skill, swapping to Sucrose, normal attacking to put Hydro on the enemy, then Sucrose's skill to swirl that Hydro as well as the Pyro on Guoba at the same time. Then we can cast Zhongling's burst, and we can then use Xingqiu's skill twice if Sacrificial Sword procs, and Zhongling's no ICD Pyro app from both her Pyronado and Guoba should let you trigger forward vaporize on all 4 hits for big damage, if all goes well. Then you just normal attack on any character, probably get another Bennett skill in for some extra energy, and start the rotation again with Xingqiu's burst when you see that his skill is about 8 to 9 seconds from cooldown, since that's how long our setup takes. And now, let's throw conventions out the window and talk about Hyperbloom. Continuing the trend of teams that were once the best in the game, this one took the lead when Nahida came out in 3.2. In a typical Hyperbloom team, rotations really don't matter. All that matters is just making sure all your character's abilities are active. The reason why is that the team has no carry or main DPS character for whom you'd be trying to optimize a DPS window. Your damage still has to come from somewhere though, so for the most part, these are transformative reaction teams where the reactions deal damage directly. That means for these teams, your goal is just to trigger the reactions as much as possible, so the only pieces of a rotation you'll have are just little sequences that optimize your reactions. For example, you can start with your Electro Trigger's AoE ability so that it can immediately hit any Dendro cores, then activate your Hydro and Dendro app, and then do whatever your 4th character does. Since we have Xingqiu, we need to normal attack constantly to proc his burst. When one of those abilities wears off, recast it, and that's about it. But as an interesting note, since I chose Fischl, I can mention that she is a character who alternates abilities each subsequent rotation, because her burst and skill both summon Oz. Otherwise, their cooldowns would be too long to use every rotation in most teams. That's all the team rotations I want to break down, but there's still a few interesting things I want to mention. The next cool thing is hit lag. When you hit an enemy with most melee attacks, your animations pause for a split second to give you the feeling of impact. The interesting thing is that some buff durations also pause in this time, whereas cooldowns do not. As a result, some characters can end up with higher uptime on their abilities than you expect. The benefits are very specific to certain characters. For example, you might be able to get an extra charged attack on Hu Tao, or maybe an extra skill on Flynn's, but for most characters you won't notice anything special. While we're talking about buff durations and cooldowns, one thing to look out for is that a few character abilities in the game that grant a buffed state won't actually start their cooldown until the buff ends. This is rare, but one example is Skirk. If you just look at skill attributes, you might think, oh, the cooldown is less than the duration, so she can have 100% uptime. Well, no, if you check the fine print, it says the cooldown doesn't start until later. Next is burst iframes, that's invincibility frames. As you probably know, dodging makes you invincible during the animation to all but a few attacks, and that invincibility during an animation is known as iframes. Elemental bursts also have iframes, and they work on even more attacks than dodges do, and the iframes almost always last longer. So if you know a big enemy attack is coming and you just can't be bothered to dodge it, if your rotation has some wiggle room on when you can cast certain abilities, you could try to time a character's elemental burst to be cast at that time instead for the same effect. Now, interestingly, looking at this clip, there's a couple more things to mention. Did you notice how the boss moved and made me miss an attack with Shallonen, so I had to do a third normal attack to trigger her skill buff rather than just two like you normally would. Second, I made a point to delay Bennett's burst to iframe the boss's attack just for this clip, but that might not have been optimal. The next thing on the rotation is Candace's skill, which can block a significant amount of damage and also gets better if you do so I probably should have just done that instead. Or, if I ignored that and went fast enough, I might have avoided the attack with Candace's burst right after. Or, of course, I could have just ignored the enemy altogether and tanked the damage because it frankly wasn't going to be enough to matter anyway. But these are all things you should keep in mind when doing your rotation on an enemy. Finally, let's talk about some of the actual endgame challenges, starting with the Spiral Abyss, and some additional rotation tricks to keep in mind when you tackle it. Firstly, you have to start every chamber on your character in slot 1. Of course, you can just immediately swap to the first character in your rotation once you start the fight, but there are things that can happen before that. If you have Serpent Spine on a character, that character should be in slot 1, so you can stack it up before starting combat. Likewise, if you have a character on Husk of Opulent Dreams, they should not be in slot 1. The next thing is that character energy is carried over from chamber to chamber, so if you are about to clear a half of chamber 1 or 2, try to avoid using bursts if you are going to need them at the start of the next chamber. See if you can trim your rotation a bit in the final seconds of a fight to accomplish this. You might not have a choice, but it's something to try for anyway. Otherwise, you'll need to vary your rotation in the next chamber to build some energy first before starting your rotation. And the last note is paying attention to enemy spawns, especially if they spawn in waves. Often, repositioning will become a part of your rotation, and sometimes even waiting to start your rotation for enemies to move around will become optimal. Most of the time, you want the enemies to be close together, or at least all in front of you, in order to hit them with AoE attacks, and if you don't have a character like Kazuha who can do it himself, you'll need to do it by manipulating the enemy's movement patterns. Before I can wrap the video up, there's one last elephant in the room we have to address. All the rotations I've talked about assume one very important thing, and that is that you begin the rotation with full energy and elemental bursts at the ready. Unfortunately, in order to further reduce the value of older characters and compel you to pull for newer 5-stars who are less energy reliant, the latest endgame challenge, Stygian Onslaught, starts all of your characters with 0 energy. You still want to do a rotation, but you likely will need to come up with a custom opening rotation that generates as much energy as you can as fast as you can, while hopefully doing at least some damage in the meantime. How this plays out will greatly depend on the team, but generally the first step is putting some extra energy recharge on any character who can afford it, especially in the form of Favonius weapons. Then hopefully you have some characters who can deal damage with their skill alone. If all goes well, you'll be able to do your second rotation normally and actually play the game. That said, since every Stygian Onslaught boss has unique mechanics, there's not much more generalized advice I can give. Plus, most Stygian cycles so far have had very outside-the-box gimmick strats that trivialize one of the bosses, usually with Jean, so you'll just have to tackle them as they come. I think I'll end this video there. I could spend another hour breaking down individual team rotations, but that would be a nightmare to record and edit, and I feel like I've laid enough groundwork that you should be able to get the most out of your teams. Now, after watching this and perhaps my other team building guides, you may be asking yourself, wow, do I really need to know all this? And the answer is maybe. For most of the game, no. But if you want to fully clear the endgame modes like Spiral Abyss, Stygian Onslaught, or even just Imaginarium Theater, a good grasp of the game mechanics will go a long way. Of course, with high enough investment, you can brute force even those modes. If you're judging my gameplay in this very video, you'll see me make multiple mistakes in my rotations, and it's not that big of a deal because my characters are way stronger than they need to be for the content. That said, if you're free to play or don't have high investment in the right characters, then this amount of knowledge, as well as just skill, will become more important. You can do it all without spending a penny. It's just harder. But personally, I find any game more fun when I actually know how everything in it ticks. Many things in these videos I didn't even know until I did the research to make them. So hopefully for anyone else out there who likes having all the information, you've enjoyed some of these guides. And if you'd like to see more, I'd love it if you'd subscribe. I have plenty more ideas for Genshin videos, including guides, opinion pieces, even some lore breakdowns, so that'll help you find them when they come out. And who knows when that'll be. Thanks for watching!